Hands where I can see them, Officer Daniel Rivers barked, gripping his flashlight tightly as it illuminated the face of a scruffy teenager huddled near a dumpster. The boy's clothes were tattered, his hair matted, and his cheeks smudged with dirt. But it wasn't just his appearance that stopped Daniel cold. It was his eyes. Familiar, piercing blue eyes, identical to his own. Daniel's breath hitched. The boy's trembling hands rose slowly, and in that instant, Daniel was no longer standing on the gritty streets of New York, but plunged into a memory he had fought to bury. The last time he'd seen his son, Caleb, 6 years ago. Could it be? His missing boy, thought to be gone forever, now standing before him? Who are you? Daniel croaked, his voice wavering. His badge felt like lead on his chest as he struggled to comprehend the scene. But the boy didn't answer. Instead, he darted past Daniel into the dark, disappearing into the maze of alleyways. Daniel's heart pounded as he ran after him, his mind racing with questions. Was this really Caleb? If it was, how had he ended up here, living on the streets? And why had he run? He rounded a corner, scanning the shadows desperately. But the boy was gone. 6 hours earlier, Daniel had been at the precinct reviewing reports from the night before. The holidays were around the corner, and while the city buzzed with festive energy, it also meant an uptick in thefts, fights, and disturbances. It had been a busy week, and Daniel, a single father and seasoned officer, was exhausted. But exhaustion was better than silence. Silence reminded him of the gaping hole in his life, the son he'd lost 6 years ago during a family trip to a crowded amusement park. One moment, Caleb had been holding his hand. The next, he was gone. No leads, no answers, just endless nights of guilt and heartbreak. That evening, Daniel had been patrolling a particularly rough neighborhood known for its transient population. His partner, Officer Rodriguez, was at a nearby diner grabbing coffee, leaving Daniel alone. As he drove past the alley, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Someone was rummaging through the trash. It wasn't unusual, but something about the figure made Daniel stop. He approached cautiously, flashlight in hand. "Hey, buddy, you can't be here," he called out. The figure froze but didn't turn around. "Don't make me say it twice," Daniel added, his voice firm but calm. Slowly, the boy turned, and that was when Daniel's world tilted. The shock lingered as he scoured the area where the boy had vanished. His radio crackled, Rodriguez checking in, but Daniel ignored it. He couldn't explain what he'd seen. Not yet. He needed answers first. As Daniel searched, he began to notice things he hadn't before. A small, makeshift shelter tucked under an overhang, scattered belongings that suggested someone had been living there. A tattered backpack leaned against the wall. Carefully, Daniel unzipped it. Inside were a few crumpled clothes, a half-eaten granola bar, and an old, weathered photograph. Daniel's hands shook as he held the photo. It was a picture of Caleb, taken on his 8th birthday. The edges were frayed, and the colors had faded, but there was no mistaking it. His boy had been here. The next morning, Daniel couldn't shake the encounter. He sat at the kitchen table in his modest apartment, staring at the photo he'd found. Beside him was a cup of coffee, long gone cold. He hadn't told anyone yet, not Rodriguez, not his sister who often nagged him about moving on, and certainly not the support group he joined for parents of missing children. Daniel's mind was a whirlwind. If Caleb was alive, why hadn't he come home? What had happened to him? And why was he living like this, scavenging in back alleys? He decided to head back to the area, this time off duty. Dressed in plain clothes, he wandered the streets, showing the photo to anyone who would stop long enough to look. Most shrugged, uninterested. A few muttered something about just another runaway. Hours passed with no sign of Caleb, and Daniel was losing hope. But then, a young woman at a soup kitchen recognized the picture. "Yeah, I've seen him," she said, ladling soup into a styrofoam cup. "Keeps to himself. Doesn't talk much. I think he calls himself Chris." "Chris?" Daniel repeated, his heart sinking. Was it possible Caleb didn't even remember who he was? Later that night, Daniel returned to the alley. It was bitterly cold, the kind of night that made you question how anyone could survive without shelter. He brought a thick jacket and a bag of food, hoping to draw Caleb out. Hours ticked by as Daniel waited, shivering in the shadows. Finally, a faint rustling broke the silence. The boy appeared, moving cautiously, his eyes scanning for danger. Daniel stepped into the light, hands raised to show he meant no harm. "I'm not here to hurt you," Daniel said softly. "I just want to talk." The boy froze, eyeing Daniel warily. For a moment, it seemed he might bolt again. But then, something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps curiosity. Slowly, he took a step forward. "What's your name?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling. The boy hesitated before whispering, "Chris." Daniel swallowed hard. "Chris," he repeated, forcing a smile. "Okay, my name's Daniel. I think I know you." Chris frowned, backing away slightly. "No, you don't," he muttered. "Yes, I do," Daniel insisted, pulling out the photo. "Look at this. This is you." Chris stared at the picture, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he snatched it and took off, disappearing into the night once more. Daniel spent the next few days piecing together everything he could about Chris. He combed through missing persons reports, checked with shelters, and even reached out to private investigators he'd worked with in the past. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. Chris wasn't just another kid on the streets. He was resourceful, clever, and fiercely independent. But he was also alone, and Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he was running from something, or someone. The more Daniel learned, the more determined he became. This wasn't just about finding his son. It was about understanding what had happened to him and helping him heal. But just as Daniel began to feel he was getting closer, an unexpected twist sent his world spiraling again. Daniel's heart stopped. Chris, no, Caleb, stood on his doorstep, trembling and soaked to the bone. His small frame looked even more fragile in the dim porch light, and his words, "They're coming for me," echoed ominously in Daniel's ears. Without hesitation, Daniel pulled him inside, locking the door behind them. The boy's wild eyes darted around the room, searching for threats. "Who's coming for you?" Daniel asked, keeping his voice steady despite the storm of questions swirling in his mind. Chris didn't answer. He collapsed onto the couch, clutching the photo of himself as if it were a lifeline. Daniel crouched in front of him, his hands resting lightly on his knees. "It's okay. You're safe here," he said gently. "No one is going to hurt you." Chris finally looked up, his expression a mixture of fear and exhaustion. "I don't know their names," he whispered. They've been following me. Watching me." "Why?" Daniel asked, leaning closer. "I don't know," Chris said, his voice breaking. "They just want me gone." Daniel's jaw tightened. He didn't need the details yet to know that someone had been hurting this boy, his boy. "Did you see them? What do they look like?" Chris shook his head. "It's a group. They hang out near the alleys. They think I know something, but I don't. I swear I don't." Daniel nodded, his cop instincts kicking in. He'd seen enough street violence to know how things worked. Kids like Chris often got caught in the crossfire of gangs, drug deals, or other criminal activity. But he also knew there was more to this story, something Chris wasn't telling him. After coaxing Chris into a hot shower and dry clothes, Daniel prepared a simple meal. He placed the food on the table and waited. The boy emerged from the bathroom wearing one of Daniel's oversized t-shirts and a pair of sweatpants rolled up at the ankles. His hair was damp and clean, his face free of grime for the first time since Daniel had seen him. "Eat," Daniel said softly, nodding toward the plate. Chris hesitated, but eventually sat down. He ate quickly, like someone who wasn't sure when their next meal would come. Daniel watched him, his heart aching. This was Caleb, his Caleb. The way he held his fork, the way his nose crinkled slightly when he chewed, it was all so painfully familiar. And yet, this boy had lived a life Daniel couldn't begin to imagine. "I need to know, Chris," Daniel said after a while. "Where have you been all this time?" Chris stiffened. He put the fork down and looked at Daniel with guarded eyes. "You don't want to know," he said flatly. "Yes, I do," Daniel said firmly. "I've spent 6 years searching for you. I need to understand." Chris stared at him for a long moment before exhaling shakily. After I got lost that day, someone found me. A man. He said he'd help me find you, but he didn't. Daniel's hands curled into fists under the table. What did he do? Chris shook his head, his eyes watering. He took me far away. Said you didn't want me anymore. That you'd left me there on purpose. Daniel's chest tightened. The thought of someone telling his son such a cruel lie made his blood boil. That's not true, he said, his voice trembling. I never stopped looking for you. Chris looked away. It doesn't matter. He left me too, after a while. And I've been on my own ever since. The hours slipped by as Chris told fragmented pieces of his story. Daniel learned about the years Chris spent bouncing between shelters and sleeping in abandoned buildings. He heard about the moments of kindness, strangers offering food or warm clothes, and the moments of cruelty when others took advantage of Chris's vulnerability. Daniel listened, his heart breaking with every word. But beneath the pain, there was a growing determination. He would protect his son, no matter what. Around midnight, Chris fell asleep on the couch, the photograph still clutched in his hand. Daniel sat nearby, watching him. He wanted to call someone, Rodriguez, maybe, or his sister, but he couldn't risk scaring Chris away. Not yet. Instead, he spent the night reviewing everything he'd learned. If Chris was being targeted, it wasn't random. Someone thought he knew something valuable. But what? And how could Daniel keep him safe while figuring it out? The next morning, Daniel woke to the sound of breaking glass. He bolted upright, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun he kept in the drawer by the couch. Chris was nowhere to be seen. Chris? Daniel called out, his voice sharp. He moved toward the kitchen, where the sound had come from. The back window was shattered, and the faint scuffle of footsteps echoed from outside. Chris, Daniel shouted, running toward the door. He threw it open just in time to see two men dragging Chris into a black van parked at the curb. Let him go, Daniel yelled, sprinting after them. But the van's engine roared to life, and it sped off, leaving Daniel standing in the street, helpless and enraged. His son had been taken, again. Daniel didn't waste a second. He called Rodriguez, his voice urgent. I need backup. My son's been kidnapped. Wait, what? Rodriguez said, clearly confused. I thought your son. I don't have time to explain. Daniel snapped. I have a lead. Meet me at my apartment. Daniel hung up and rushed back inside, his mind racing. He grabbed his badge, his gun, and his phone. This time, he wouldn't let Caleb slip through his fingers. Whatever it took, whoever he had to face, Daniel was going to bring his son home. Daniel paced his apartment, every nerve on edge. His phone sat on the coffee table, open to the call he'd just made to dispatch. Backup was on its way, but every second felt like an eternity. His son, his Caleb, was out there again, and this time, Daniel knew for certain that whoever had taken him didn't plan to leave things to chance. A knock at the door jolted him. Daniel flung it open to find Officer Rodriguez standing there, a concerned look on his face. Talk to me, Rodriguez said, stepping inside. Daniel wasted no time. They took him. Two men. Black van. No plates. They smashed the window in the kitchen and grabbed him before I could stop them. Rodriguez frowned. Hold on. Are we talking about your son? The one who? Yes, Daniel interrupted, his tone sharp. It's him. Caleb. He's alive, and I need to find him. Rodriguez hesitated, his expression a mixture of disbelief and concern. Daniel, are you sure about this? It's been. I'm sure, Daniel snapped. I've been searching for him for 6 years. He showed up at my door last night. He's alive, and he's in trouble. Rodriguez nodded, his demeanor shifting into action mode. Okay, let's focus. Did you see anything that could help us identify the van? Stickers, dents, anything? Daniel shook his head, frustrated. It was too dark. I couldn't get a good look. What about the men? Could you describe them? Tall, both of them. One had a hoodie. The other, I don't know, maybe a leather jacket? I couldn't see their faces. Rodriguez sighed. That's not much to go on, but it's a start. Let's check traffic cameras in the area. If the van passed through any intersections, we might get a lead. The two officers headed to the precinct, where they pulled up footage from cameras near Daniel's apartment. It was tedious work, combing through hours of recordings, but eventually, they found what they were looking for. A black van speeding down a side street, heading toward the industrial district. There, Rodriguez said, pointing at the screen. Looks like they're heading south. Daniel's jaw tightened. That area's a dead zone. Old warehouses, no cameras. Rodriguez gave him a sidelong glance. Exactly the kind of place you'd take someone if you didn't want to be found. Daniel and Rodriguez geared up, calling in a small team for backup. As they drove toward the industrial district, Daniel's mind raced with questions. Who were these men? What did they want with Caleb? And why had Caleb come to him last night, knowing he was in danger? Do you think this could be gang-related? Rodriguez asked, breaking the silence. Maybe Caleb got mixed up in something on the streets. Maybe, Daniel admitted. But he said he didn't know why they were after him. It doesn't make sense. Rodriguez glanced at him. You sure he's telling the truth? Daniel shot him a glare. He's my son, Rodriguez. He doesn't have to lie to me. Rodriguez raised his hands in mock surrender. Just saying. Kids on the streets. They learn to survive however they can. Daniel didn't respond. He couldn't let himself doubt Caleb, not now. The van's trail led them to a decrepit warehouse on the edge of the district. The building was surrounded by overgrown weeds and rusted fences. It looked abandoned, but Daniel's instincts told him otherwise. Looks quiet, Rodriguez said as they parked a block away. Too quiet. Daniel nodded. Let's move. The team approached the warehouse cautiously, weapons drawn. Rodriguez signaled for two officers to circle around back, while he and Daniel headed for the front entrance. The large, rusted doors groaned as they pushed them open, revealing a cavernous space filled with shadows. The smell of oil and mildew hung heavy in the air. Rows of crates and machinery created a maze of hiding spots, and the silence was deafening. Spread out, Rodriguez whispered, motioning for the team to fan out and search the area. Daniel's pulse quickened as he moved deeper into the building. His flashlight swept across the room, illuminating graffiti-covered walls and discarded trash. He strained his ears, listening for any sound that might lead him to Caleb. Then, he heard it, a faint shuffling noise coming from behind a stack of crates. Daniel froze, holding up a hand to signal Rodriguez. I'm going in, Daniel whispered, edging closer. As he rounded the corner, his flashlight landed on Caleb, tied to a chair with duct tape over his mouth. His eyes widened when he saw Daniel, and he struggled against his bindings. Caleb, Daniel whispered urgently, rushing to him. He ripped the tape off Caleb's mouth and began untying the ropes. Dad, they're still here. Caleb hissed, his voice frantic. Before Daniel could react, a shadow loomed behind him. A hand clamped over his shoulder, and he was yanked backward, thrown to the ground. Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio. We've got movement. Officers, converge on Daniel's location. Daniel scrambled to his feet just as two men emerged from the shadows. One of them lunged at him with a crowbar, and Daniel narrowly dodged the swing. The other reached for Caleb, but Daniel tackled him before he could get too close. The fight was chaotic. Daniel's training kicked in, and he managed to land a punch that sent one of the men sprawling. But the other was relentless, swinging the crowbar with brutal force. Run, Caleb, Daniel shouted, but Caleb hesitated, frozen with fear. The sound of boots pounding against the concrete signaled the arrival of backup. Rodriguez and the other officers burst onto the scene, their weapons drawn. Drop it, Rodriguez barked. The man with the crowbar hesitated, then threw it down, raising his hands in surrender. The other man tried to make a run for it, but was quickly subdued by the team. As the chaos settled, Daniel turned to Caleb, who was trembling but unharmed. He pulled his son into a tight embrace, relief washing over him. It's okay, Daniel murmured. You're safe now. But even as he held Caleb, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. These men were just pawns in a larger game, and whoever was behind them wasn't going to give up easily. Caleb's words chilled Daniel to the bone. There's more of them. And they're coming. Daniel pulled back, looking into his son's frightened eyes. What do you mean? Who's coming? Caleb hesitated, his lips trembling. I don't know what they call themselves, but they've been after me for a while. They're the reason I couldn't stay in one place. They're everywhere, Dad. They always find me." Daniel wanted to press him for details, but he could see the exhaustion in Caleb's face. Whatever this was, it had been a long, terrifying ordeal for him. Rodriguez approached, his expression grim. "We've got the 2 suspects cuffed and ready for transport. I'll see what I can get out of them at the station." Daniel nodded, his focus still on Caleb. "I'm taking him home," he said firmly. "We'll debrief later." Rodriguez clapped him on the shoulder. "Take care of your boy. I've got your back." Back at Daniel's apartment, Caleb looked around nervously, as if expecting someone to burst through the door at any moment. Daniel set his gun on the counter, locked the doors, and checked the windows twice before sitting Caleb down. "You're safe now," Daniel reassured him. "No one can hurt you here." Caleb didn't seem convinced. He sat hunched on the couch, his knees pulled to his chest. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "They're not just random people. They have money, connections. They can make people disappear, like I did." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Tell me everything, Caleb. Who are they? What do they want from you?" Caleb sighed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to get involved. I was just trying to survive. I overheard something I wasn't supposed to, something bad. I didn't know it mattered at the time, but they found out. They think I'll talk." Daniel leaned forward. "What did you hear?" Caleb shook his head. "I can't say. If they find out I told you, they'll hurt you too. They don't care who gets in their way." Daniel placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "Listen to me. I'm a police officer. My job is to protect people, especially you. Whatever it is, I can handle it. But I need you to trust me." Caleb hesitated, then finally nodded. "It was a deal. Some guys were talking about moving something illegal. Drugs, I think. They said it was a big shipment, worth millions. I didn't mean to hear it, but they saw me." Daniel's stomach churned. A drug operation of that scale wasn't just street-level crime. This was organized, likely involving dangerous individuals who wouldn't think twice about silencing a witness, especially a vulnerable teenager. "Do you know where this deal is happening?" Daniel asked, his voice steady despite the tension building inside him. Caleb nodded reluctantly. "An old dockyard near the river. I think it's going down tomorrow night." The next day was a blur of activity. Daniel worked to keep Caleb safe while gathering as much intel as he could. Rodriguez had interrogated the 2 men from the warehouse, but they'd refused to cooperate. Meanwhile, Daniel reached out to trusted colleagues, discreetly piecing together information about the dockyard and any recent reports of criminal activity in the area. By evening, Daniel had a plan. He would stake out the dockyard with a small team, gather evidence of the deal, and shut it down. But as much as he wanted to protect Caleb, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. "You're not going with me," Daniel told Caleb firmly as they sat at the dinner table. "It's too dangerous." "But what if they see you?" Caleb argued. "What if they know I told you?" "They won't," Daniel assured him. "You're staying here with someone I trust." Later that night, Daniel dropped Caleb off at his sister's house. She was one of the few people he trusted completely, and he knew she'd keep Caleb safe. "I'll be back soon," Daniel promised Caleb. "Stay inside, and don't open the door for anyone except me." Caleb nodded reluctantly, his worry evident. "Be careful, Dad." At the dockyard, the air was thick with tension. The sound of waves lapping against the shore was the only noise as Daniel and his team positioned themselves around the area. The dock was dimly lit, with shadows stretching across the ground like creeping fingers. Through his binoculars, Daniel spotted movement near one of the warehouses. A group of men was unloading crates from a truck and loading them onto a small boat. "Looks like we've got our players," Rodriguez whispered over the radio. Daniel nodded, his adrenaline spiking. "Wait for my signal." The team watched as the men worked quickly, their movements precise and practiced. One of them, a tall man in a suit, appeared to be in charge. He stood apart from the others, talking on a phone. Daniel focused on the man, his instincts telling him this was someone important. He raised his radio. "Hold positions. I'm moving in for a closer look." Carefully, Daniel crept forward, staying low and using the crates for cover. He managed to get within earshot of the man in the suit, who was still on the phone. No, everything's on schedule. The man was saying, we'll be done in an hour. The kid? Don't worry. He's not going to talk. We'll take care of him after this. Daniel's blood ran cold. They were still after Caleb. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the dockyard as one of the crates tipped over, spilling its contents, packages wrapped in plastic. The men spun around, guns drawn, scanning the area for intruders. Move in now. Daniel barked into his radio. The team stormed the dockyard, weapons drawn. Chaos erupted as the suspects opened fire, bullets ricocheting off the crates. Daniel ducked behind cover, his heart pounding. Cover me, Rodriguez shouted, returning fire as he advanced. Daniel spotted the man in the suit, making a run for it toward the boat. Without thinking, he broke cover and sprinted after him, weaving through the gunfire. Stop, Daniel shouted, drawing his weapon. The man turned, pulling a gun of his own. For a split second, the two men stared each other down, the tension crackling like electricity. The gunshot echoed across the dockyard, piercing through the cacophony of shouting and gunfire. Daniel instinctively ducked, bracing for impact, but the bullet whizzed past him, striking the crate behind him. The man in the suit smirked and bolted toward the boat, his shoes slapping against the weathered wood of the dock. Stop, Daniel roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. He took off after the man, every muscle in his body screaming as he pushed himself to close the distance. The suspect reached the boat and leapt aboard, barking orders to the driver. The engines sputtered to life, spewing black smoke as the vessel began to pull away from the dock. Daniel didn't think. He ran full speed and jumped, landing hard on the edge of the boat. His hands gripped the railing as he scrambled to pull himself up. Get him off, the man shouted, kicking at Daniel's hands. Daniel gritted his teeth and held on, swinging his leg up to hook it over the railing. He hauled himself onto the deck, narrowly dodging another kick. As he stood, the man lunged at him, throwing a wild punch. Daniel ducked, countering with a solid blow to the man's ribs. The man staggered but recovered quickly, drawing a knife from his belt. He slashed at Daniel, the blade catching the light as it came dangerously close to his face. Daniel grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it until the knife clattered to the deck. You're not going anywhere, Daniel growled, pinning the man against the side of the boat. The driver, realizing the situation was turning against them, veered the boat sharply, trying to throw Daniel off balance. Both men stumbled, but Daniel recovered first. He delivered a swift punch that sent the man in the suit crumpling to the floor. Back on the dock, Rodriguez and the team had subdued the other suspects. Officers moved quickly, securing the scene and confiscating the contraband. The boat was brought back to the dock, and Daniel dragged the man in the suit off the deck, handing him over to waiting officers. Who's your boss? Daniel demanded, his voice cold and steady. The man smirked, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. You think you've won? This is bigger than you, cop. You don't even know what you've stepped into. Daniel clenched his fists, but before he could press further, Rodriguez intervened. We'll get him talking at the station. Let's focus on processing the scene. Hours later, Daniel sat in the precinct's interrogation room, staring through the one-way mirror at the man in the suit. The suspect was calm, too calm for someone who had just been caught in the middle of a massive drug operation. Rodriguez entered the observation room, holding a folder. We ran his prints. Name's Victor Hayes. Mid-level player, but connected to some heavy hitters. Rumor is he works for someone big, a name we haven't cracked yet. Daniel frowned. And he knows something about Caleb. He mentioned the kid during the deal. Rodriguez nodded. Yeah, I caught that. We've got him for trafficking, illegal possession of a firearm, and resisting arrest, but getting him to talk about Caleb? That's going to take some work. Back at his sister's house, Daniel found Caleb sitting on the couch, anxiously wringing his hands. The moment Caleb saw him, he jumped to his feet. Are you okay? What happened? Daniel pulled him into a hug. I'm fine. We got them, Caleb. The people who took you. At least some of them. Caleb didn't look relieved. It's not over. They won't stop. Daniel knelt in front of him, meeting his eyes. Listen to me. You're safe here. They can't hurt you anymore. I promise. Caleb hesitated, then nodded. Okay. But the fear in his eyes lingered, and Daniel knew this was far from over. The next day, Daniel returned to the precinct, determined to crack Victor Hayes. He entered the interrogation room, sitting across from the man who had almost taken his son from him. You've got two options, Victor, Daniel began. You cooperate, and maybe the DA goes easy on you. Or you stay quiet, and you go down for everything we found at the dockyard. Victor leaned back in his chair, smirking. You think I'm scared of a little jail time? I've done worse than this, and I'll do it again. Daniel slammed his hands on the table, his frustration boiling over. This isn't just about the drugs. It's about my son. What do you know about him? Victor raised an eyebrow. Oh, the kid? That's what this is about. Don't play dumb, Daniel snapped. You mentioned him at the dock. You know something. Start talking. Victor chuckled. You've got guts. I'll give you that. But you're out of your league, Rivers. Daniel froze. How do you know my name? Victor's grin widened. You think we don't know who you are? You think we don't know where you live? Daniel's blood ran cold. What are you saying? Victor leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. This isn't just about the kid. It's about you. And if you keep digging, you're going to regret it. Daniel left the room, his mind racing. Victor's words replayed in his head like a sinister echo. Someone higher up was pulling the strings, and they knew who he was. This wasn't just about Caleb overhearing the wrong conversation. It was personal. As Daniel stood in the hallway, trying to piece everything together, his phone buzzed. It was a text from his sister. You need to come back. Now. Daniel's knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel, weaving through traffic with his siren blaring. His sister's words echoed in his head. Someone was here. They were looking for Caleb. Every second felt like an eternity, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. When he reached his sister's house, he barely waited for the car to stop before jumping out and sprinting to the door. She opened it immediately, her face pale and drawn. Where's Caleb? Daniel demanded. He's in the basement, she said, her voice trembling. I locked the door and stayed down there with him until they left. Daniel nodded, brushing past her and heading straight for the basement. He found Caleb sitting on a small couch, his arms wrapped tightly around his knees. His wide, frightened eyes shot up to meet Daniel's as soon as he entered. Dad! Caleb sprang up and ran to him, burying his face in Daniel's chest. They came. They were banging on the door, shouting my name. I thought they were going to break in. Daniel held him tightly, his jaw clenched. You're okay now. I'm here. After calming Caleb down, Daniel returned upstairs to question his sister. What exactly happened? She took a deep breath, trying to steady her voice. It was about an hour after you left. A black SUV pulled up outside. Two men got out and came to the door. They knocked hard, too hard. I didn't answer, and they started shouting, saying they knew Caleb was here and that we should hand him over. Daniel's stomach churned. Did they try to force their way in? No, she said. But they stood outside for a long time, talking to each other. One of them walked around the house, looking in the windows. That's when I took Caleb to the basement and locked the door. Eventually, they left, but I don't know where they went. Daniel nodded, his mind already formulating a plan. Did you recognize them? Anything that stood out? She shook her head. No, but they were dressed sharp. Like businessmen, not street thugs. Daniel frowned. This confirmed his suspicion that whoever was after Caleb had significant resources. This wasn't a random gang. It was something much more organized. Daniel called Rodriguez to fill him in on the situation. They came for him again. This time at my sister's house, he said, pacing the living room. I can't keep moving him around. I need to put an end to this. Rodriguez sighed on the other end of the line. I'm digging into Victor Hayes' connections, but so far, everything's a dead end. These guys are good at covering their tracks. I need to go to the source, Daniel said firmly. Hayes knows more than he's letting on. I'm going to make him talk. Daniel, you need to be careful, Rodriguez warned. If these people know where you live, they're not going to stop at intimidation. You're putting yourself and Caleb at risk. I don't have a choice, Daniel said. They're not going to stop until they have him. The next morning, Daniel returned to the precinct with a renewed sense of determination. He entered the interrogation room where Victor Hayes sat, his hands cuffed to the table. Hayes looked up, his smirk as infuriating as ever. "Back for round 2, Officer Rivers?" Hayes taunted. "Or should I say, Dad?" Daniel ignored the jab and sat down across from him. "This isn't a game, Hayes. You know who's after my son, and you're going to tell me everything." Hayes chuckled, shaking his head. "You think I'm scared of you? You're nothing compared to the people I work for." Daniel leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "Maybe you don't care about what I can do, but I guarantee you'll care about what happens when your bosses find out you're talking to me. They'll cut you loose the second you stop being useful to them. So tell me, how long do you think you'll last once they know you've been caught?" The smirk faltered for a moment, and Daniel pressed harder. "If you help me, I can protect you. Witness protection, reduced charges, you name it. But if you don't, you're on your own." Hayes's confidence wavered. He shifted in his seat, avoiding Daniel's gaze. Finally, he sighed. "Fine, I'll tell you what I know. But you're not going to like it." Hayes's information painted a grim picture. The people after Caleb were part of a shadowy organization involved in trafficking, drugs, weapons, even people. They had vast networks and resources, and their influence reached far beyond the city. "They don't like loose ends," Hayes said. "And your kid? He's a loose end. He heard something he shouldn't have, and now they're cleaning up." Daniel's fists clenched under the table. "Who's in charge? Give me a name." Hayes hesitated, then leaned in close. "They call him Bishop. No one knows his real name, but he's the one running the show. If you want to keep your kid safe, you'll stay far away from him." Daniel didn't flinch. "Where can I find him?" Hayes snorted. "You think he's just sitting around waiting for you? He doesn't get his hands dirty. But if you want to draw him out, you'll need to disrupt his operations. Hit him where it hurts." Armed with this new information, Daniel returned home, his mind racing. Caleb deserved a life free from fear, and Daniel was willing to risk everything to give it to him. That night, as Daniel tucked Caleb into bed, Caleb looked up at him with pleading eyes. "Are they going to come back?" Daniel brushed a hand through his son's hair. "Not if I can help it," he said firmly. "I'm going to stop them, Caleb. I promise." But as he sat alone in the living room, reviewing Hayes's intel, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to step into a battle far bigger than he'd anticipated. Daniel stared at the anonymous text message, his chest tightening. The threat was clear, but backing off wasn't an option. His son's life was on the line, and he had already come too far to stop now. He clenched his jaw, typing a response. "Come for me if you're brave enough, but leave my son out of this." He hesitated for a split second before hitting send, knowing it was risky but hoping to buy himself time by diverting their attention. Moments later, his phone vibrated again. This time, the message was chillingly specific. "You should check on Caleb. Maybe we've already been there." Daniel shot to his feet, his heart pounding. He raced upstairs to Caleb's room and flung the door open. Caleb sat upright in bed, startled by the sudden noise. "Dad, what's wrong?" Caleb asked, his voice shaky. Daniel's eyes darted around the room, scanning for any signs of intrusion. He checked the windows, the closet, under the bed. Everything was untouched. He let out a shaky breath and sat beside Caleb. "I thought something was wrong," Daniel admitted, ruffling Caleb's hair. "But everything's okay." Caleb frowned, sensing his father's unease. "Are they coming back?" Daniel looked at him, his voice steady but resolute. "Not if I can stop them." The next morning, Daniel took Caleb to a secure safe house arranged through a trusted colleague in the force. The building was nondescript, tucked away in a quiet part of the city, and guarded around the clock. Daniel hated leaving Caleb there, but he knew it was the safest place for him while he confronted the shadowy organization targeting them. "Stay here," Daniel told Caleb as they stood at the door. "I'll come back as soon as it's safe." Caleb clung to him, his voice breaking. "What if something happens to you?" Daniel knelt to his son's level, gripping his shoulders firmly. "Nothing's going to happen to me. I'll do whatever it takes to protect you. But I need you to stay here and trust me, okay?" Caleb nodded reluctantly, and Daniel hugged him tightly before stepping away. With Caleb safe, Daniel shifted his focus to the information Victor Hayes had given him. The name Bishop echoed in his mind as he pored over files, maps, and surveillance footage. Bishop wasn't just a name. It was a title, a figure that commanded respect and fear in equal measure. If Daniel could dismantle Bishop's network, he might have a chance to end this nightmare for good. Rodriguez joined Daniel at the precinct, spreading a map across the table. Based on what Hayes told us, these are the key locations tied to their operations. Distribution points, stash houses, drop sites. It's all connected. Daniel studied the map, his finger tracing a route that led to an abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city. This one, he said, tapping the location. It's isolated, perfect for a high-level meeting. If Bishop's involved, this is where we'll find him. Rodriguez frowned. This isn't a one-man job, Daniel. We need backup, intel, a warrant. We can't just storm in there blind. I'm not waiting for bureaucracy, Daniel snapped. Every second we waste, Caleb is in danger. Rodriguez sighed. Fine, but you're not going in alone. I'm coming with you. That night, Daniel and Rodriguez prepared for the operation. Dressed in plain clothes and armed with concealed weapons, they parked a few blocks away from the factory and approached on foot. The building loomed ahead, its windows broken and its walls covered in graffiti. Faint light glowed from within, and the low hum of voices carried through the night air. Looks like they're here, Rodriguez whispered, his hand on his weapon. Daniel nodded, his adrenaline spiking. Let's move. Inside the factory, a group of men stood around a table stacked with cash and packages of drugs. At the head of the table was a man who exuded authority, his presence commanding attention. Daniel's instincts screamed that this was Bishop. The two officers crept closer, staying hidden behind machinery as they listened to the conversation. The kid's a liability, Bishop said, his voice cold and calculated. I want him gone before he causes more problems. Daniel's blood boiled. He motioned for Rodriguez to stay back as he pulled out his phone, recording the exchange. One of the men spoke up. What about the cop? Rivers. He's been poking around. Bishop smirked. Rivers doesn't know what he's up against. We'll take care of him when the time comes. Daniel couldn't stay silent any longer. He stepped out of the shadows, his gun drawn. The time has already come. The men froze, their hands hovering near their weapons. Bishop raised an eyebrow, seemingly unimpressed. Well, Bishop said, his tone dripping with amusement. The infamous Officer Rivers. I've heard so much about you. Drop the act, Daniel growled. You're done, Bishop. We've got you on tape. Surrender now, and maybe you'll live to see a courtroom. Bishop laughed, a low, menacing sound. You think this is over because you walked in here with a gun? You don't understand who you're dealing with. As if on cue, the lights in the factory flickered, and more men emerged from the shadows, weapons in hand. Daniel and Rodriguez were outnumbered, but Daniel didn't back down. You're making a mistake, Bishop said, stepping closer. Walk away now, and I'll let you live. Stay, and you'll regret it. Daniel's voice was steady. I don't negotiate with criminals. The room erupted in chaos as Bishop's men advanced, their weapons raised. Daniel dove behind a stack of crates, dragging Rodriguez with him. Bullets ricocheted off the metal machinery, the deafening cracks echoing through the factory. We're pinned, Rodriguez yelled, firing a few shots over the top of the crates. Daniel grabbed his radio, speaking quickly over the gunfire. Officer down at the old factory off 7th Street. Requesting immediate backup. Shots fired. Rodriguez glanced at him. You think they'll get here before we're toast? Daniel's jaw tightened. We'll hold them off until they do. Bishop watched the chaos unfold from the safety of a nearby platform. He seemed almost amused as his men exchanged fire with the two officers. This is why I run the show, he muttered to himself, signaling to one of his lieutenants. Cut them off. No one leaves alive. Daniel peeked around the corner of the crates, spotting a group of men trying to flank them. He motioned to Rodriguez. Cover me. I'm moving. Rodriguez nodded, laying down suppressive fire as Daniel sprinted to another piece of cover. He fired back, taking down one of the assailants and forcing the others to retreat. Where's that backup? Rodriguez shouted. As if in answer, the distant wail of sirens cut through the gunfire. Outside the factory, police vehicles skidded to a stop, and officers poured out, weapons drawn. They quickly surrounded the building, shouting for everyone inside to surrender. "Drop your weapons and come out with your hands up," a commanding officer barked through a megaphone. Inside, Bishop's men began to panic. Some dropped their weapons and raised their hands, while others tried to make a break for it. Bishop remained calm, his eyes scanning the room for an exit. Spotting a service ladder leading to the roof, he began to climb. Daniel saw him and shouted, "Bishop's on the move." He bolted after him, leaving Rodriguez to secure the remaining suspects. The ladder creaked under Bishop's weight as he climbed, the cold night air biting at his face as he reached the roof. He turned, expecting to see no one behind him, but Daniel was already closing in. "You're not getting away," Daniel said, his gun trained on Bishop. Bishop smirked, his hands raised mockingly. "You're a persistent one, Rivers. But you're too late. The wheels are already in motion." "What wheels?" Daniel demanded, his finger hovering over the trigger. Bishop tilted his head. "You think this is just about me? My organization is everywhere. You take me down, and someone else steps in. You'll never win." Daniel stepped closer, his gun unwavering. "You're right, I can't stop all of you. But I can stop you. And that's a start." Bishop lunged suddenly, knocking the gun from Daniel's hand. The two men grappled, trading punches as they teetered dangerously close to the edge of the roof. Daniel managed to land a solid hit, sending Bishop stumbling backward. But Bishop recovered quickly, drawing a knife from his belt. "You should have walked away," Bishop sneered, advancing. Daniel dodged the first swipe of the blade, grabbing a loose pipe from the ground to defend himself. The two clashed, the fight growing more desperate with each passing second. Below, officers flooded the factory, arresting Bishop's remaining men. Rodriguez looked up, spotting the struggle on the roof. "Daniel's up there," he shouted, pointing. A group of officers rushed to find access to the roof, but time was running out. On the roof, Daniel's endurance was wearing thin. Bishop's strikes grew more erratic, but also more dangerous. Finally, Daniel saw an opening. He swung the pipe with all his strength, knocking the knife out of Bishop's hand. Bishop staggered, his balance faltering near the edge. He looked down, then back at Daniel, a flicker of fear crossing his face for the first time. "It's over, Bishop," Daniel said, breathing hard. "Surrender, or I'll make sure you don't walk out of here." Bishop glared at him, then took a step back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Fine," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You win, for now." Suddenly, he spun around and leapt off the roof onto a lower section of the building. Daniel rushed to the edge, watching as Bishop disappeared into the shadows below. "Damn it," Daniel growled, slamming his fist against the ledge. Backup arrived on the roof moments later. Rodriguez pulled Daniel aside. "You okay?" Daniel nodded, though frustration was etched into his face. "Bishop got away. But we have his men, and we've dismantled this operation. It's not a total loss." Rodriguez nodded. "We'll get him, Daniel. One way or another." As dawn broke, Daniel returned to the safe house to check on Caleb. The boy ran to him the moment he walked through the door, throwing his arms around his father. "Are you okay?" Caleb asked, his voice small. Daniel knelt, holding him close. "I'm fine, but we're not done yet. The man behind this is still out there." Caleb's eyes filled with fear. "What if he comes for me again?" Daniel met his gaze, his voice steady. "I won't let that happen. No matter what it takes, I'll keep you safe." The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of the safe house, but Daniel couldn't shake the storm brewing in his mind. He stood at the kitchen counter, sipping lukewarm coffee and replaying the events from the factory. Bishop's escape wasn't just a loose end. It was a ticking time bomb. Caleb sat at the table, silently picking at his breakfast. He was still rattled, his usual cautious demeanor replaced with outright fear. Daniel set the mug down and sat across from him. "You're safe here," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm. "This place is secure. No one's getting in without me knowing." Caleb nodded, but his eyes remained on the table. "He's not going to stop, is he?" Daniel hesitated. He couldn't lie to his son. No, he admitted. Not until we stop him first. Caleb finally looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. What if I'm the problem? If they're after me, maybe. He trailed off, his meaning clear. Daniel leaned forward, placing a reassuring hand on Caleb's. You're not the problem, Caleb. You're the victim here. They're the ones who are wrong, and I'm not letting them win. Caleb didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. That afternoon, Daniel met with Rodriguez at the precinct. The mood was tense as they reviewed everything they had on Bishop and his network. We've got plenty of evidence from the factory bust, Rodriguez said, scrolling through photos on his laptop. Drugs, money, weapons. But Bishop? He's a ghost. No ID, no digital trail. The guy knows how to stay off the grid. Daniel rubbed his temples, frustration mounting. What about his men? Anyone willing to talk? Rodriguez shook his head. We've been interrogating them all morning. They're loyal, or they're too scared to say anything. Either way, they're not giving us what we need. What about Victor Hayes? Daniel asked. Rodriguez frowned. Hayes is playing the same game. He thinks staying quiet will buy him protection from Bishop, but it's only a matter of time before Bishop cuts him loose. Daniel leaned back, his mind racing. We need leverage. Something that forces Hayes, or one of Bishop's men, to cooperate. Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. You've got something in mind? Daniel hesitated, then nodded. Bishop mentioned that Caleb is a loose end. He thinks Caleb knows something that could hurt him. That means there's information out there, something we don't have yet, and you think Caleb might know what it is? Daniel sighed. He might, but I need to be careful how I approach it. He's already been through enough. That evening, Daniel sat with Caleb in the living room of the safe house. The TV played quietly in the background, but neither of them was paying attention. Daniel finally broke the silence. Caleb, can we talk about what you overheard? Caleb shifted uncomfortably. I already told you. It was about a deal, something illegal. I didn't understand most of it. Daniel nodded. I know, but there might be more to it. Something you didn't realize was important at the time. Caleb hesitated, then sighed. They were talking about a shipment. Drugs, I think. But there was another word they kept using. Cargo. I thought they meant more drugs, but I don't know. Daniel's stomach tightened. The term cargo in these contexts often referred to human trafficking. Did they say where the shipment was going? Caleb shook his head. No, but they mentioned a date. It's soon. Daniel pressed further. Do you remember anything else? Names, places? Caleb thought for a moment, then his eyes lit up. There was one name. They kept saying it over and over. Providence. I don't know if it's a place or a person, but it sounded important. The next day, Daniel brought the information to Rodriguez. Providence, he said, dropping a folder onto the desk. Caleb thinks it's connected to the next shipment. Rodriguez flipped through the file. There's a Providence port not too far from here. If they're moving something big, that could be the place. Daniel nodded. We need eyes on that port. If Bishop's using it, we can catch him in the act. Rodriguez frowned. It's risky. A place like that will be crawling with security, both legal and illegal. If this goes south, it won't, Daniel said firmly. We'll be ready. That night, Daniel and Rodriguez prepared for the operation. Dressed in tactical gear, they assembled a small team and headed to the port. The air was tense as they approached, the sprawling docks lit by towering floodlights. Using binoculars, Daniel scanned the area. A group of men was gathered near a shipping container, their movements hurried and precise. That's them, Daniel said. Let's move. The team moved in silently, taking up positions around the container. Daniel's heart raced as he signaled for the team to surround the suspects. Police. Hands in the air. Daniel shouted, stepping into the light. The men froze, then scattered in all directions. The team sprang into action, chasing down the fleeing suspects. Daniel focused on the container. Its doors were slightly ajar, and a strange sound came from within, a muffled cry. He motioned for Rodriguez to cover him as he approached. Pulling the doors open, Daniel's worst fears were confirmed. Inside were several frightened individuals, bound and gagged. Human trafficking victims. We've got hostages, Daniel shouted, calling for immediate medical assistance. As the team secured the scene, Daniel spotted a familiar figure in the distance. Bishop. He was retreating toward a waiting SUV. Daniel bolted after him, adrenaline surging through his veins. "Stop," he yelled, but Bishop didn't slow down. Bishop climbed into the SUV, and the vehicle roared to life. Daniel raised his weapon, aiming for the tires. The SUV careened out of control, smashing into a stack of shipping crates with a deafening crash. Sparks flew as the vehicle skidded to a halt, its front end crumpled against the metal containers. Daniel sprinted toward the wreckage, his gun trained on the vehicle's doors. "Don't move," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The driver's door swung open, and a man stumbled out, holding his hands in the air. "I'm just the driver. Don't shoot," he pleaded, dropping to his knees. Daniel ignored him, his focus on the passenger side. The door creaked open, and Bishop emerged, clutching his side. His tailored suit was torn, and blood stained the fabric where shards of glass had cut him. "You've got nowhere to run, Bishop," Daniel said, stepping closer. Bishop's smirk returned, despite his injuries. "You think this changes anything? Arrest me, and a dozen more will take my place." Daniel's grip on his gun tightened. "You're done, Bishop. Your network is crumbling. The people you've hurt will get justice." Bishop chuckled darkly. "Justice? You don't know the meaning of the word. This isn't about justice, it's about survival. And you, Officer Rivers, just signed your death warrant." Rodriguez and the rest of the team arrived, weapons drawn. "We've got this, Daniel," Rodriguez said, moving to cuff Bishop. Daniel stepped back, his heart still racing as the team secured the scene. As Bishop was led away, Daniel couldn't help but feel a flicker of doubt. Was this really the end? At the precinct, Bishop was placed in a high-security holding cell. Daniel watched through the observation window as Bishop sat calmly, his expression unreadable. "What's the play here?" Rodriguez asked, joining Daniel. "We keep pressing," Daniel said. "Bishop knows more than he's letting on. He's the key to dismantling the rest of the network." Rodriguez nodded. "We've got him on trafficking, drug distribution, and conspiracy charges. That's enough to put him away for life. But if he starts talking, we can take down his whole operation." Daniel's phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the conversation. He stepped away to answer it. "Hello? Dad, it's me." Caleb's voice came through, shaky but relieved. "Are you okay?" Daniel smiled, the tension in his chest easing. "I'm fine, Caleb. We got him." "Bishop?" Caleb asked. "Yes. He's in custody now. You're safe." There was a pause before Caleb spoke again. "Does this mean it's over?" Daniel hesitated. "We're getting close. But I need you to stay at the safe house a little longer, just to be sure." "Okay," Caleb said softly. "I trust you." The following morning, Daniel sat across from Bishop in the interrogation room. The man exuded confidence, even in handcuffs. "You're in a lot of trouble, Bishop," Daniel began. "You're facing decades in prison. But if you cooperate, we can talk about a deal." Bishop leaned back in his chair, his smirk unwavering. "And why would I do that? Prison or no prison, I'll be just fine." "You think your people will come for you?" Daniel asked, his tone sharp. "Don't count on it. The moment you were arrested, you became expendable. They'll cut ties to save themselves." Bishop's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "You don't know how this world works, Rivers. Even if I talk, you won't get far. There's always someone else waiting to step in." Daniel leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "Maybe, but every step we take weakens your operation. Every person we save, every asset we seize, it all adds up. And it starts with you." Bishop's gaze hardened, and for a moment, the two men locked eyes in a silent battle of wills. That evening, Daniel returned to the safe house to check on Caleb. He found his son sitting on the couch, sketching in a notebook. "Hey, kiddo," Daniel said, ruffling Caleb's hair as he sat beside him. Caleb smiled faintly. "Did you get him to talk?" "Not yet," Daniel admitted. "But we will. People like Bishop think they're untouchable, but everyone has a breaking point." Caleb hesitated, then looked up at his father. What if he has friends? What if they come after us? Daniel placed a reassuring hand on Caleb's shoulder. We're ready for them. I've got the best people working with me, and we're going to protect you no matter what. As night fell, Daniel's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Rodriguez. We've got movement. Bishop's people are trying to cover their tracks. Meet me at the precinct. The precinct was alive with urgency when Daniel arrived. Officers moved briskly, files in hand, as Rodriguez waved him into a briefing room. A map of the city's industrial district was displayed on the screen, marked with red circles. We've got a lead, Rodriguez said without preamble. Bishop's people are scrambling. Our informant says they're planning to evacuate critical assets tonight, likely to relocate their operations. This might be our last chance to dismantle the organization before they vanish. Daniel nodded, his resolve hardening. Where's the target? Rodriguez pointed to the map. An abandoned rail yard on the east side. It's remote, easy to defend, and close to major highways. If they're staging a retreat, this is the place. What about Bishop? Daniel asked. Rodriguez's expression darkened. He hasn't said a word, but my gut tells me this is tied to him. Even in custody, he's pulling strings. Daniel took a deep breath. Let's gear up. We're taking them down. The raid was planned meticulously. Under the cover of darkness, Daniel and a team of officers surrounded the rail yard. Trucks idled near the warehouses, their engines humming softly. Shadowy figures moved quickly, loading crates into the vehicles. Daniel spoke into his radio. Hold positions. Wait for my signal. Through his binoculars, he spotted a familiar face among the crowd. One of Bishop's lieutenants, a man Daniel had seen at the factory bust, was barking orders, his voice carrying across the yard. This is it, Daniel whispered. We've got them. The takedown was swift and precise. Officers stormed the rail yard, shouting commands as chaos erupted. Some suspects surrendered immediately, dropping to their knees with their hands up. Others tried to flee, only to be intercepted by the perimeter team. Daniel focused on the lieutenant, chasing him through the maze of containers. The man was fast, but Daniel was faster. He tackled him to the ground, cuffing his hands behind his back. Where's the rest of the operation? Daniel demanded. The lieutenant smirked. You think this is the end? You've barely scratched the surface. Daniel hauled him to his feet. We'll see about that. By dawn, the raid was over. Dozens of suspects were in custody, and the rail yard was secured. Officers cataloged evidence, drugs, weapons, and documents that could lead to more arrests. Rodriguez approached Daniel, his face a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. This was a big win, he said. We've crippled their network. Daniel nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. What about Caleb? Is he finally safe? Rodriguez placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You've done everything you can, Daniel. The rest is up to the system. 2 weeks later, Daniel sat across from Bishop in the interrogation room. The once arrogant criminal was now a shadow of himself, his confidence chipped away by isolation and the collapse of his empire. Your people are gone, Daniel said. Your network is in shambles. This is your last chance to cooperate. Bishop stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. Fine. You want names? Places? I'll give them to you. But you better keep your end of the deal. We will, Daniel said, signaling to Rodriguez, who stood behind the glass. Over the following weeks, Bishop's information led to a series of raids and arrests, dismantling the remnants of his organization. Caleb's name was removed from their list of targets, and Daniel felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he and Caleb could begin to heal. One evening, Daniel and Caleb sat on the porch of their new home, far from the chaos of the city. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon. Do you think it's really over? Caleb asked, leaning against his father. Daniel wrapped an arm around him. I do. And even if it's not, we'll face whatever comes together. Caleb smiled, his eyes brighter than they had been in years. I'm glad you found me, Dad. Daniel looked at his son, his voice thick with emotion. I never stopped looking, Caleb. Not for a second. As they sat there, watching the stars appear one by one, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. No matter what the future held, he knew they would face it together, father and son, stronger than ever. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, life began to settle into something Daniel had almost forgotten: normalcy. The safe house became a memory, the constant fear of threats a thing of the past. Bishop's organization had been thoroughly dismantled, and Daniel and Caleb were finally free to rebuild their lives without looking over their shoulders. Caleb started school again, slowly regaining the confidence he had lost during the years on the streets. He made friends, joined a local soccer team, and began to smile more, a real, genuine smile that Daniel hadn't seen in so long. For Daniel, the transition wasn't as easy. He carried the weight of everything that had happened: the nights spent searching for Caleb, the danger they had both faced, and the guilt of not being able to protect his son sooner. But as he watched Caleb thrive, those burdens began to lighten. One evening, Daniel stood in the kitchen, flipping through a stack of papers Caleb had brought home from school. One page caught his eye, a short essay titled "My Hero." In the essay, Caleb had written about Daniel, describing him as someone who never gave up, no matter how hard things got. The final line read, "My dad taught me that no matter how dark life gets, there's always someone who will fight to bring you back into the light." Daniel's throat tightened as he read those words. He folded the paper carefully and placed it back on the table, wiping at his eyes before Caleb could see. On a crisp autumn evening, the two of them visited the park where they used to go before Caleb disappeared. Daniel brought a soccer ball, and they spent hours kicking it back and forth, laughing and shouting like nothing else in the world mattered. As the sun dipped low, Caleb flopped onto the grass, out of breath but grinning. Daniel joined him, lying back and staring at the sky, which was now streaked with purples and reds. "Hey, Dad," Caleb said after a moment of silence. "Yeah, buddy? Thanks for not giving up on me." Daniel turned his head to look at his son, his heart swelling with pride and love. "I could never give up on you, Caleb. You're my son, my world." Caleb smiled, his eyes bright. "I'm glad I found my way back to you." Daniel reached over, squeezing Caleb's shoulder gently. "We found our way back to each other." As they lay there, side by side, Daniel knew the journey had been worth every struggle, every sleepless night. They had fought for each other, and they had won. No matter what challenges lay ahead, Daniel knew one thing for certain: they would face them together, stronger than ever. This was their new beginning. Their story of loss and reunion, fear and love, had finally reached its conclusion, and it was a happy ending.